Thank you all for being here. I was saying yesterday that it's wonderful to be invited to something like this and have this many people read your book, or this many people who are supposed to have read your book. And for me to have been invited to something like this twice, it's a big deal. So thank you for having me once, when many of you were probably 13 years old. Thank you for having me back for a second time. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my new book, The Last Ballad, that came out in October. Talk a little bit about the book itself, how I came to know about the story the book is based on, and I'll read just the first 75 or 80 pages of it. I'm kidding. You're like, I got class at 1, man. You better read fast. I'll read a little bit and then take any questions y'all might have about the book, or writing books, or agents. Some of you may be writers. You may have a manuscript ready to go out the door, and you may be wondering about how to publish it, or what to do with it, or where to go next. We can talk about those things. So my book, The Last Ballad, is based on the true story of a woman named Ella Mae Wiggins. It's set in the summer of 1929 in my hometown of Gastonia, North Carolina. Some of y'all might be familiar with Gastonia. You may have passed through there and sped up on 85 or 74. I don't know what you know about Gastonia. When I was working on my second book, This Dark Road to Mercy, it's inspired by the murder of 2 young girls I knew growing up in Gastonia. And I went to the public library when I was researching that book and just doing some work on it. And I asked the librarian, I said, I'm trying to locate the story of these 2 girls I knew growing up. And it's not funny, but she said, oh, we may have that in our murder file. And I said, you have a murder file? And she said, yes. So we went back into the records room, and they just had a huge file cabinet that just said murder. And it was just murders in Gastonia. I was like, this is not a good look. Keep this away from people and retitle it. Just call it like Unfortunate Things That Happened to People in Gastonia. This murder is kind of a bold title for a file cabinet. But this happened in Gastonia, North Carolina in 1929. And when my novel opens, Ella Mae Wiggins is 28 years old. She is working the night shift at a mill called American Mill Number 2. She's working 72 hours a week, 6 12-hour night shifts. She earns $9 a week. She has lost one of her children to whooping cough. She has 4 more children at home she's trying to keep alive. Her husband has abandoned her. She lives in a predominantly African-American community, which in 1929 for a single white woman was absolutely unheard of. And she's literally starving to death. She knows that if her life doesn't change, she might die. She knows if her life doesn't change, her children might die. She's already lost one child, and she's pretty certain she's going to lose another one. And then she hears about a strike over in Gastonia, which is 7 miles to the east. This strike has occurred at a textile mill called Lore. Lore was built in 1900 by local investors, and when it was built, it was one of the largest mills in the country at 600,000 square feet. If you've ever driven past Lore, it's still there. It takes up an entire city block. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. It's 6 stories. It's an enormous building. But these people at the mill have voted to strike in 1929 for a couple of reasons. When the mill industry began in the late 19th and early 20th century in places like Gastonia and Spartanburg and Shelby and Lowell and Macadamville and as far east as Charlotte, they sent barkers up into the hills. They sent men up into the hills in places like Bryson City, Franklin, Johnson City, Tennessee, Newport, Tennessee. They sent them out to the farms in places like Cleveland County and Gaston County and down into the South Carolina upstate. And these barkers said, leave the mountains, leave the farm, come on down to the mills. If you come down to the mills, we'll pay you cash money, which is valuable because the old economy is based on bartering. You have milk, you barter for cloth. You have cloth, you barter for eggs. You have pigs, you barter for a cow. But then when the cash-based economy comes in, suddenly people don't want to barter anymore. They want money. They want money they can go spend at the store. Stores are a relatively new thing in the early 20th century up in Appalachia. They want money. And the mill said, come down to the mills. We'll pay you money. We'll also give you a house you can live in. We'll give you a school where your kids can go to school. We'll give you a church that you can go to church in. We'll give you a store where you can spend the money we pay you. We'll give you everything you ever need. All you have to do is come down and work. So people left the mountains in droves and the farms in droves. And they got down to the mills and they found themselves shackled to a cycle of poverty they couldn't escape. In the years leading up to World War I, there was incredible demand for cotton cloth because you're making parachutes, you're making uniforms, you're making radial belts for car tires and tanks. You're making all the stuff the military needs. And then after World War I is over, that demand for cotton cloth fell. What's also happening is men's suits are getting tighter. Women's skirts are getting shorter. We have the rise of the flapper movement. If anybody's read Great Gatsby or seen Great Gatsby, you can imagine how clothes are literally getting half as big. And so the demand for cotton cloth falls. People begin to lose their job. Unemployment skyrockets. When unemployment goes up, wages fall. So you have people out of work. The people who are holding on to a job are getting paid less than ever before. The conditions in these mill villages are awful. They don't have indoor plumbing. They don't have bathtubs. They don't have heat. At a place like Luray, which has since been sold to a northern company up in Providence, Rhode Island, they put up a chain-link fence around the mill. They don't allow parents to go home during breaks and check on their kids. Many families had both parents and some children working inside the mills, leaving young toddlers, 3, 4 years old, at home alone at night, and you weren't allowed to go check on your child. They instituted something called the stretch out, which mechanized the workforce, which brought in machines and laid people off. And the people who kept their job were required to operate these machines, which created greater output for the mills and paid them less. So the mills are making more money than ever before, the people are making less money than ever before, and these unions are looking around trying to organize workers to change labor conditions, to create labor laws, of which there were very few at the time. And so a union at Luray, a communist-led labor union from New York City, came down to the town of Gastonia and organized the workers at Luray on April 1st, and the night shift voted to strike. About 1,000 workers voted to strike. And Ella May, working at a mill 7 miles away, hears about this strike. And she hears about the union's list of demands because she gets a union leaflet. And the union demands are things like this: a 40-hour work week. Ella works 72 hours a week. A $20 minimum wage per week. Ella earns $9. Equal pay for equal work. And Ella knows there are men in the mill doing her job, getting paid more than she is. Luckily, we don't have to worry about that now, right, women? Men and women are all paid the same, right? And then recognition of the union. And Ella's looking at this list of demands, and she says, if these things come true, it's not that I'm going to get a Corvette and a condo in Myrtle Beach and a satellite TV and a big screen. If this list of demands comes true, maybe my kids won't die. Maybe I won't die. And she has to decide, is she going to go to this union rally and find out more about the union and try to organize her own mill? If she tries to organize her own mill, she's going to be fired. And if she's fired, her kids might die. But if she stays in this job, her kids might die. And so at the opening of the novel, she's stuck in this very untenable situation. She doesn't know what to do. And when the novel opens, she's sitting outside the office at American Mill number 2. She's been called down there off the line, off the night shift, because she laid out of her shift on Friday night to care for her daughter, Rose, who's 3 years old. And Rose has whooping cough. And Ella has to stay at night sometimes, because that's when she's the sickest. And she's asked the manager, Dobbins, her shift manager, put me on days. I need to work days. My daughter's sick at night. She might die. I need to be home. I need to keep her alive. And they won't put her on days. And so Friday night, she stays out of her shift. And then Saturday night when she goes to work, the owner of the mill calls her into her office and demands answers about why she's not been at work. And Ella falls under this myth of the working poor that we still have in America. We have this myth that the working poor don't work hard enough. Some of you may have some opinions on that. Some of you may be working your you-know-whats off and you're still poor, and I apologize that that's happening to you. Ella worked 72 hours a week and earned $9. She was literally dying because she was working so hard. Ella couldn't work any harder than she was working, and she still faced death. And that scene, that sentiment kind of unfolds in this scene here. Goldberg's brother is the owner of the mill. A chair sat in front of Goldberg's brother's desk, but he did not ask Ella to sit down, so she did not sit. He pushed himself back from his desk and put his hands in his lap. His thin lips formed a straight line. "I'm glad you joined us for your shift this evening," he said. "Yes, sir," Ella said. She did not look at him when she spoke, choosing instead to focus on the other things on his desk aside from the ledger and ink pen. A small wooden globe with etchings too faded to read, an empty mug, a half-eaten sandwich of some kind, a shiny red apple. "I'm saying that because you missed last night's shift." "Yes, sir," she said again. "Mrs. Wiggins?" he said. "It's May." Her eyes darted to his for a moment, returned to rest on the half-eaten sandwich. "What?" "It's May. Ella May." "Well, I've got Wiggins written down here." "It's May," she said again. "I told Dobbins to change it, but I guess he didn't." "Why have you been missing your shifts, Mrs. May?" "Shift," Ella said. "I just missed the one shift last night." "No," Goldberg's brother said. He leaned toward his desk, picked up a clipboard, flipped through a sheath of papers. No, you missed one in January and one in March." "It's been a long time since March," Ella said. "It's been even longer since January." "That's not the point," he said. "Why are you missing shifts?" "I got a sick little girl at home. She gets bad at night, and I had to stay home," she said. "I asked Dobbins to put me on day shift, but he won't do it. Maybe I should have asked you." "Dobbins handles shift change requests," he said. "Well, he didn't handle mine," Ella said. "And now he told me to come down here, and that's just going to set me back even more." Goldberg's brother leaned back in his chair, placed his hands in his lap again. Ella stared at the sandwich on his desk, tried to judge what kind of meat rested between the slices of bread. "You have a sick little girl," he said. "Yes, sir." "Please look at me, Mrs. May. I can't tell whether or not you're being truthful unless you look at me." She lifted her eyes to his, saw that he stared at her intently, saw that her missed shift must mean a great deal to him, but she knew it meant even more to her because she would not be paid. "Why wouldn't I be truthful?" "I don't know, Mrs. May. People often don't tell the truth when they lay out of work. Sick means drunk. Sick means gambling. Sick means lazy. I don't know what a sick little girl means." She felt blood rush to her face, knew that her cheeks were flush with color. Her guilt, or whatever it was she had just felt, faded. She imagined throwing herself across the desk, reaching for his neck, his eyes. "Sick means my little girl's sick," she said. "That's what it means." He stared at her for a moment, then lifted a wastebasket from beneath his desk and swept the sandwich and apple into it. He returned the wastebasket to the floor. "What if all my employees had sick children, Mrs. May? What about me? What if I had a sick child and I decided that I couldn't come to work? Who'd run this mill?" Ella had never seen Goldberg's brother's family, knew nothing about them aside from their existence and the existence of the older brother. She had never been inside the Goldberg's large brick home, and she had never met anyone who'd been inside it either. She envisioned electric lights and running water and warm blankets and bed sheets and a pantry full of food and a cooler full of ice, a pair of soft warm slippers tucked beneath a neatly made bed. A baby might cry out somewhere upstairs, and a nurse or a maid or a young cousin would ascend a grand curved staircase and open a nursery door and whisper something kind and reassuring to the child inside. "Yes, sir," Ella said. "Who'd run this mill?" Goldberg's brother asked again. "Nobody." "That's correct. Nobody. And you know who runs your spinners when you decide to lay it on a shift? Nobody." He leaned forward again. "But I can assure you of this, Mrs. Wiggins. It'll be much easier to find someone to operate your spinners than it will be to find someone to run this mill. I expect you'll keep that in mind next time you find yourself with the desire to stay home." So after that scene, Ella is influenced to go to the strike the next day, to go to this rally. And on the back of this union leaflet that she's been carrying for a month that lists the union demands, she's been writing song lyrics to the tune of a well-known ballad. And she's been writing song lyrics about her own life, about her life in the mills, about her struggles as a mother, about how her kids are starving, about how she can't save the money to buy them new shoes or food. And that night at the rally, the organizers, who want to prove that this strike, the power of it, the word of it, has spread beyond Gastonia, they convince Ella to get on stage. She's not from this mill, she's from a different mill. They convince her to get on stage, tell her story of being from the mountains of East Tennessee and coming down the mountain to the mill, and then sing her song, which is later called Mill Mother's Lament. And when she does that, it immediately makes her the face of the strike, and it makes her dangerous to the mills, and it endangers her life. That summer, Ella would go on to write and perform protest songs that Woody Guthrie, who's probably America's best-known folk singer, would later perform. Woody Guthrie called her the greatest protest songwriter of all time. Pete Seeger would go on to record some of her music. She would travel to Washington, D.C., and confront North Carolina senators about the plight of working mothers and the effects on their children in southern mills. And she would single-handedly integrate the labor union against the will of the labor union by inviting her African-American neighbors in Stumptown to join her. And she was a civil rights leader before anybody said the term civil rights. She was a feminist before anybody said the term feminist. She was murdered later in the summer, in mid-September, on the way to a protest in support of some jailed strikers. She was murdered by people hired by the mill, by Lorre Mill. They were arrested. Lorre paid their bail. The mill paid their bail. Then the mill paid their legal defenses, and no one was ever charged for Ella's murder. Her surviving children went to an orphanage. Their father had abandoned them. They went to an orphanage, and they literally disappeared from history. The strike that summer made headlines in every major newspaper around the world. Gastonia, North Carolina was on the front page of every major newspaper around the world, as was Ella May. But after the strike ended, it disappeared from history. I grew up in Gastonia. My parents were both born in mill villages, my dad in Shelby and my mom in Gastonia. They never heard a word about Ella May. Never even heard the word Lorre, because Firestone bought it in 1938 and changed the name of the mill, changed the name of the street it was on to Firestone. My mother's maiden name is Wiggins. My grandfather was 22 years old the summer that a woman who shared his last name was murdered just a few miles from where he worked in a mill very similar to the one she was striking at. And nobody ever talked about it. I didn't know the story of the strike in Ella May until I went to graduate school in Louisiana in 2003. And I told one of the professors, asked where I was from, and I said, I'm from Gastonia, North Carolina. And I'm used to saying, like, it's near Charlotte and kind of near Asheville. I'm used to having to explain, what Gastonia is. Either that or Mary Jo's clothing outlet. And he said, oh, Gastonia, home of the Lorre Mill strike. And I said, yeah, of course. I didn't want to appear stupid on my first day in graduate school. And so I Googled it and found out that one of the seminal moments in American labor history happened in my hometown. And I had never learned about it. I had never been taught it. No one had ever discussed it with me. And so I wanted to write this novel to try to reclaim something about my own past. My family came from the mills. They came from western North Carolina and the farms in the upstate and hoped to find a good life in the mills. And my parents hoped to find a good life in the suburbs. They wanted to get out of the mills. And I wanted to try to understand something of my own past in writing a book like this one. Does anybody have any questions about the book, writing the book, or researching the book, or scandals involving the book, or publishing, or writing, or yeah?
Was your own personal views, did you incorporate those when you were writing the book?
Did I incorporate my own personal views when writing the book? I think that everything, there's a North Carolina writer named Charles Chestnut who is from Eastern North Carolina. He said fiction is the power of rearranging your memory. And I would say that fiction is also the power of rearranging or depositing your feelings, your emotions, your suspicions, your prejudices into what you're writing. And I'm sure I did that, sure. I am probably more in line with Ella's worldview than I am with the manager of Lorre, Hugo Guyon. But I know Hugo Guyon. Hugo Guyon's in my family. I would be lying if I said that I haven't had sentiments similar to his during my lifetime. I would be lying if I said that I'm guilty, I'm innocent of gender prejudice or race prejudice or anything like that. And so I think that at different times in my life, if I'm being honest with you, we all are, if we're being honest with ourselves. And so I think there's a little bit of me in all these characters. And I didn't want to write a novel that said, can't we all just get along? Because we can't. Sorry, we can't. It'd be great if we could. We can't. And we won't. And that's outside of race or gender. That's intraracial. That's, people who look like you and talk like you and act like you. Those are some of the people you hate. You hate their guts more than you could ever imagine hating anybody else's. I didn't want to write a novel that said, here's all the answers. Here it is. Put a bow on it. I'm done. I solved it. That doesn't serve any purpose. And those kind of novels those are like proletariat novels where labor is the answer, where these easy fixes, these easy solutions. And those are usually boring novels full of flat characters that feel like little morality tales. And I didn't want to write that. I wanted to write a really complicated novel where nobody was all good and nobody was all bad. And you're suspicious of the impulses of everyone, right? So even getting Ella up on the stage, these organizers were thinking, poor, check, female, check, singer, check, knows a bunch of black people, check, put her up there, right? Because in a lot of ways they were fetishizing, it's a strange word to use in relation to this discussion, but they were fetishizing Ella May. And they were saying, this is the ultimate example of the person we're trying to help. Let's put her on the stage and promote her. And that's happened throughout Appalachia. I mean, there's something known as poverty pornography, where you go find the poorest person you can and take a photo of them and say, this is everybody in Appalachia. They need your money and your prayers and your help. But it's not. It's not. So some of my views went in here, but every view I've held at one time or another is in here. That was a long answer. They kind of went off the rails a little bit. I apologize. Yes, sir.
What do you consider the best sources that you had for your writing?
What do I consider the best sources that I had for my writing? Not a lot is known about Ella May. We know she was born in East Tennessee in 1900. She was probably born in Cott County and went to Sevierville with her family, Sevier County. Her father was a tenant farmer. We know they moved to the lumber camps. We know about when she arrived in Cowpens. My grandmother, my mother's mother, would have been about 2 or 3 when Ella arrived in Cowpens. My mother's mother's from Cowpens. We know the birth dates of some of her children. We know the death dates, I believe, of all of them. Her husband, John, died in the 60s, died in the late 60s, so he lived for quite a long time. But not a lot is known about her. And so I had to find a way to get to her. And what I did was I created other characters and watched how they reacted to her as she passed through their lives. So I created a character like Virgil, this struggling alcoholic down in Cowpens who is kind of come under the thumb of this strong, independent woman. And then he runs into Ella May, and then she swindles him for some pork rinds and a moon pie and a Coke and on the floor of the mill. And I'm like, okay, I know something about Ella now. If she can do that to this grown man, what else can she do? And so I kind of found Ella through the eyes of other people. And then when I found her, I felt, man, I know this woman now. I've seen how this rich lady Catherine reacts to her. I've seen how Percy Epps reacts to her. I've seen how Hampton reacts to her. Like there's a scene where this African-American organizer, I mean, I know you've all read and memorized the book, but there's a scene where an African-American organizer comes down to help organize black workers, and Ella's like, you're dressed too nice. And while she's, dressing him down a little bit, she takes his watch off of his wrist without him realizing it and says, put this in your pocket. Like you can't roll up in some poor person's house with that watch on. They're not going to listen to a word you have to say. And so once I saw her do things like that, I was like, oh, I know Ella now. So that was kind of how I got to Ella. But in terms of the research itself, I did a lot of historical research in libraries on databases and primary text. Read a lot of interviews. UNC Chapel Hill has a great database called Documenting the American South. And you can go on there and find dozens and dozens and dozens of audio interviews with mill workers from the early part of the 20th century, mid-20th century, and they're shocking. They're amazing, hearing these people's voices. I also listen to a lot of music. If y'all know the band Old Crow Medicine Show, Wagon Wheel, that's like the song everybody knows. Darius Rucker did not write that song. They wrote that song. But I'm friends with the lead singer of Old Crow, and he said, I was telling him about the book, and he said, there's a lot of music that came out of Gastonia. I had no idea. There's compilations of music written about mill life in Gastonia, so I listened to that, found a lot of those old songs. And then I could also go to these places. Lorre is still there. It's been converted into high-end luxury apartments, which feels strange, but it's still there. The mill Ella worked at, American Mill Number 2, is still there. Stumptown is still there. And so I could go to these places, and that was probably the most beneficial thing. Going inside of the mill Ella worked at the same time of year she would have been working there. It does something to you when you can walk in someone's shoes and then try to write about what those shoes were like. Yes, sir, in the back.
What inspired you to reveal about her death at the beginning of the book rather than make it more of a twist at the end of the novel?
That's a great question. What inspired me to reveal her death at the beginning of the book? Well, my publisher put it on the inside flap, I think. Thanks for that. And then I had to change the book. No, I'm just kidding. I decided to do that because, A, it's a true story, and if the reader felt so inclined, they could go and Google her and find out what happened. But also, I wanted everything she did, everything she reached for, everything she hoped for, every hug she gave her children, every consolation she gave her friends, every moment of bravery and tragedy to be colored for the reader by the fact that she was going to be murdered. I wanted you to know that. When she hugs her daughter Rose, I wanted the reader to say she's going to be murdered. This little girl she's hugging, who she's willing to go to the ends of the earth for, is going to grow up without a mother. And I wanted the reader to have the emotional weight of that realization. I'm not really a big plot twist guy. I'm not smart enough as a writer to fool the reader and at the end to have a big reveal. I mean, there's kind of a reveal in this novel, but it was just kind of accidental. It just kind of happened that way. I didn't really plan it. But I'm not a smart enough writer like, I don't know, I can't think of any smart writers right now. But to at the end be like, ta-da! And you'd be like, oh my gosh, I didn't see it coming. I didn't write Gone Girl, right? I wish I had, but I didn't. And so I'd rather you know the information at the beginning and then work toward how is that information going to be revealed to the other characters, or is how is this thing I've set out going to be executed. That was really interesting to me, to try to do that. Yes, right in the center.
How many characters in the story did you make up versus like how many were actually real?
How many characters in the novel did I make up versus how many are actually real? I mean, even the real ones I made up, to be honest with you. For Ella, for example, I think I got her right, but I don't know. You know, her family members, none of whom knew her when they were alive, said they feel like I did, but they don't know her either. They grew up with anecdotes and folklore and all this stuff. But Ella was a real person. Fred Beale, the organizer of the strike, he was a real person. If you look at pictures of him, he's how I described him. Red hair, flopped over, ratty suit. Ella's friend Sophia Blevin is based on an organizer named Sophie Melvin, who was a real person. Velma Birch is based on an amalgam of two female organizers who were from New Jersey and Pennsylvania. They were real people. Hampton Haywood's based on a real person who was sent down from New York to try to integrate the Union, and he was sent back. He was met at the train station by the strikers themselves, who were racist and sent him back. They refused to work with him. The Macadam family was a real family. Macadamville is a real place. I changed the name of it. But the family is not that family. It just happens there was a family named Macadam. But the house they live in is a real place in Macadamville. The mill is like that. The mill did have brick homes. It was a nicer place that cared for its workers a little better. The Goldberg brothers who own Ella's mill, they were real people. They were Latvian Jews who were treated that way by white mill owners. Percy Epps is based on a real person who ran security and was an attorney for Lorre. Violet, I made Violet up, and her mother, and her little sister, Iva. And then the children were largely made up. Ella, actually, the only thing that's not true that I've told you is Ella didn't have 5 children, she had 9, and 4 of them died. And so in the novel, I gave her 5 and had 1 of them die, because I thought contemporary readers can't conceptualize losing 4 children and having someone go on with their lives. And so I tried to squeeze all the emotion of losing 4 children into her losing her son, Willie. Oh, and A. Philip Randolph from the Sleeping Car Porters, he was a real organizer for that union. Thanks, somebody. Yes, ma'am.
How long did it take you to write this book?
How long did it take me to write this book? I got the idea while I was finishing my second novel, This Dark Road to Mercy. That's kind of when I know. A friend of mine's a writer named Jill McCorkle, and I've heard her say the same thing. You know you're ready to move on to something. You know you're ready to let go of what you're working on when you're ready to move on to something else. And when I was finishing This Dark Road to Mercy, my second novel, I had begun thinking about and sketching out this book. I'd wanted to write it since I learned about it, but I knew I wasn't a good enough writer or researcher and just didn't have the ability. Not to say that I have it now necessarily, but I certainly didn't have it then. So I started writing it in 2012, around 2012. But this is the first novel I wrote while living in North Carolina. I wrote my first novel living in Louisiana and wrote my second novel living in West Virginia. And this is the first novel I've written living in North Carolina, which was kind of challenging, to be honest. I didn't write it from a place of nostalgia and emotion because I didn't miss it because I was there, which made it a little bit different. Thank you. Yes, sir.
What is your favorite part of the writing process?
What is my favorite writing process? There's an old quote that says, writing is hell, not writing is hell, the only good thing is having written. And it's kind of like going to the gym. Going to the gym is hell, not going to the gym is hell, the only good thing is having gone to the gym. So my favorite part of the writing process, man, I don't know. For a long time, writing was a hobby for me. It was this little private thing that I nurtured through a slew of jobs and different life events. When I was teaching in West Virginia, I was teaching 4 classes a semester, which is not a lot to your faculty here, but it was a lot for me. And I was advising and working with student groups and basically living on campus and campus housing and in apartments. And my class would start at 9, and so I would get up at 6, and I would write for 2 hours, take a shower, and then run up the hill to teach. And then at night I would grade papers, and then I would try to write till about midnight. And that was my hobby, and it was sweet and it was nurtured. But then when your hobby becomes your job, it very much becomes your job. And there's an expectation that comes with having a job that is not placed on you when you have a hobby. And so not that the act of writing when I'm in the space of a book has changed so much, it still feels the same. But there is a certain awareness that this may be read. I'm being paid to do this, however meagerly, I'm being paid to do this, and there's a financial expectation at the end of this. And so some of that is in your mind when you're writing. You don't want it to be, but it is. I don't really think about anyone ever reading the book when I'm writing it. Like the day before publication, I'm like, oh, people are gonna read this. But when I'm writing it, I don't ever think about that because it just seems ridiculous to think anybody's ever gonna read what's on your computer page. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that. So my favorite part about writing is when something surprising happens, right? A character becomes clear, a plot point reveals itself, or there's a big reveal. So with the character of Virgil in this book, there's a reveal with Virgil. And I pushed away from the desk and just thought, I didn't do this. How did this happen? How did this happen? It's just this it makes you sound crazy. It's just this mysterious thing that just reveals itself. That's one of my favorite parts. And when I have something like that, or I'm in the middle of a good scene, or I found the thread of where I'm going, a lot of times I'll get up from the desk and revel in that and stretch that feeling out as long as I can. I'll go for a walk, I'll go run some errands, I'll go play with my kids, I'll go do something. And then when I sit back down at the desk feels, it's got that glow about it that I left it with. Because I like coming to the desk with that feel instead of coming to the desk cold. which is a bad place to be sometimes. Yes?
I had this connection between Hampton and Claire late at night, and I was wondering, like, what was that all about?
What was it about? The connection between Hampton and Claire, that scene? Like, what was it about? Like, flirty? Is that what you mean, or?
I mean, like, I don't know, like, why was it chose to put in, like...
Okay, sure. Why did I put the scene with Hampton and Claire on the train? Yeah. Because it was forbidden, you know, for Claire to be a 22-year-old white woman on a train with a 25-year-old black porter in the middle of the night would have been scandalous. And I wanted that tension to be on the scene, and I also wanted the menace of that. Because they're not doing anything, they're not even touching, but they're talking. He's looking her in the eye, right? This is 1929. This is, it's 1929, it's 25 years. 25 years before a black child in Mississippi is lynched for whistling at a white woman. 25 years before that. That child was 14 years old, right? Whistling at a white woman who was like 30. Turns out he didn't even whistle at her, she made that up. This little boy was lynched. He's taken out, pulled out of his uncle's bed in the middle of the night, shot, had his genitals mutilated, had a cotton gin hung around his neck by barbed wire and thrown in a lake, right? These men they were tried and they weren't convicted, and they sold their confession story to a magazine for a bunch of money. Hampton talking to a white girl in the middle of the night is 25 years before that, right? Before that. So I wanted that to be a tense scene, but I also wanted it to be a scene where two people are interested in one another. They're both clearly interested in something, whether it's the allure of danger, whether they're attracted to one another, whether they just find one another friendly. I wanted that scene to be felt. I wanted the reader to say, why does something that wouldn't feel dangerous now feel dangerous, right? What kind of intellectual gymnastics am I going to have to do through history to understand what's going on here? And so, you know, when they meet up later, I wanted both of them to be like, oh, no, because that's what would have happened. You know, that's what would have happened. But I love that scene. I think there's something about nighttime scenes. There's a novel called Song of Solomon by a writer named Toni Morrison, which is one of my favorite novels. And there's a scene where a woman wakes up in the middle of the night. She lives at home with her parents, and she hears her father and her younger brother and some other men in the kitchen discussing something like very important. And it's this magical moment where she says, like, is this what men do at night? Do they stay up late and discuss things and come to the kitchen at my parents' house? And it's this like secret magical thing. I don't know, have you read it? It's like this secret magical thing that like happens like in isolation. And I wanted that train scene to kind of feel like that, to have that magic about it. I think, yeah.
Okay, what was your favorite part of the book to write?
My favorite part of the book to write, oh man, gosh, I don't know. All of it's great. No. My favorite part of the book to write, I like Lily, Ella's daughter. I liked writing her section. That section changed a lot. At first, I had Lily being like this twangy old granny woman being like, Lord of mercy, I'm going to tell you about the time my mama done got killed. And I thought, oh man, the world does not need that. We do not need that. We got enough of that on A&E, hillbillies up in the mountains and all this stuff. The world does not need that. And so I thought, you know, who are some people I know from Appalachia who are strong women who aren't stereotypes, right? Who won't allow a reader to say like, oh, of course, you know. Of course, that's who she is. And I thought about a friend of mine who's a writer named Gail Godwin, who's in her late 80s, who's from Asheville originally. And she's just a brilliant person and a brilliant writer. Her novel Flora, which came out in 2013, is one of the most perfect books I've ever read in my entire life. She wrote it when she was like 88 years old. She's just a wonder to me. And that's how Gail talks. And I got to kind of channel her voice writing about Lily, and it felt familiar and comfortable and also necessary. It felt necessary in terms of representation. Maybe one more question, yes? I'll take one after this. We got a little time. Do I plan on writing any more books about historical Southern murders? Do you have any you want to tell me about? I don't know. I don't know. You know, I've got some ideas for another book. I'm under contract for another book, but I don't know. I don't know. Murder is kind of a natural point to begin from, because there's obviously two competing forces in murder, the one who doesn't want to die and the one who wants that person to die. And from that tension comes story. Story is always based on tension. Story comes from character desire thwarted. You find out what the character wants, and then you try to stop the character from getting that, and the story comes from how do they get around that thing. But I don't have any plans right now to write. Nothing on my radar. It's not to say I won't, but nothing on my radar. Any other? Yes, sir.
As an author, you talked about how you wanted your characters to have depth. You didn't want them to be author all bad. You said some people write very one-dimensional characters. How do you feel as an author and writer in general, the best way to achieve a very three-dimensional character that has depth? You get that into audience time, you can capture a man and a woman, like whoever you are.
Okay, so he asked about writing deep characters. That's a good question, man. I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that. Instead of writing flat characters. I feel like I write strong female characters. I feel like that's my strength as a writer. The hardest character to write would be a 40-year-old straight white dude, middle-class background from Gastonia. That would scare the hell out of me. Because I'd be writing that, I'd be like, oh, they're going to judge me, they're going to think this, they're going to think that. But writing a character who is not like me I feel an element of freedom in that. Not freedom to do whatever I want and just go crazy, but freedom to pull from models that I know. So with Ella, I thought about strong women I knew. I thought about the historical Ella. I thought about strong women I knew. I thought about portrayals I'd seen in novels and films and songs, and I pulled from all of those things. But then something of me also goes into Ella. I've got children, right? I can't imagine losing one of my children. I was working on this novel. My wife gave birth to both of our kids while I was writing this book. That's pathetic. That's pathetic. My wife is like, you done with your book yet? I'm on my second human. And while I was writing this book, I held two babies right after they were born, and I thought, what if I were to lose one of these, right? What if I were to lose one of these because I was working 72 hours a week and couldn't make enough money to keep this child alive? And so some of me goes into that representation of Ella. But when it comes to characterization, I just try to dig and dig. What do they want? What do they want? What's in their way? What's in their way? How does where they're from limit them? How does it define them? What are they trying to get away from? What are they running toward? How do people in their lives respond to them? And I just keep trying to go. And I always make sure that characters are not triggers in the plot. If you create a character or have a character do something solely as a mechanism to move the plot forward, I think you're doing it wrong. Unless you're writing like a slick commercial novel that's going to make $1 billion, which do if you can. But the kind of books I'm trying to write about deep characters that have deeply conflicted characters who don't know what decision to make, right? Who are products of a place and a time and not products of a plot so much. You all have been a wonderfully attentive audience, and I appreciate all the attention and for you inviting me here. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you so much.